so much of this stems in pessimism. It's really just such a pessimistic, I know it's called critical theory. It's just such a pessimistic, negative view of humanity and individuals and people, right? The idea that, I've literally met hundreds of thousands of people at this point, and in different countries, in 30 something different countries. And you learn most people are decent. Most people want to get on with life. You want to have a career, be happy, find romance, have a family. That's generally what people are about. They're not trying to run around, harming or hurting each other. If that were the case, then cities in general would just be a nightmare, right? You wouldn't be able to have cities like London and New York where you've just got so much diversity across the whole board. People would just be maiming each other constantly. And it's like, that's not the case. And I think also the hysteria, it turns away people who otherwise could be allied in many ways. I don't really like the term ally because it's been it's been sort of ruined, but yes. It turns away people who could be allies. So when people say all white people are racist, right? Or when someone says, all, and this is something I have to be careful with sometimes myself, because, I'm no fan of sort of, wokeism and a lot of the social justice stuff, but I myself have to be careful sometimes to try not to paint with too broad a brush on that side, just like I don't want someone to say like, oh, all conservatives are X, or all libertarians are Y, or all these people are whatever. But I think one of the issues there is, I think that on the left side of the spectrum, I think you do this very well, and this is something I really admire you for, is that I think on that side of the spectrum, people are less willing to acknowledge and rein in the crazies, right? Like I think most it's very hard to find like a conservative who is defensive of the real alt-right, or who is defensive of actual, neo-Nazis or white supremacists, or, legitimate far-right people, right? It's like, no, this is the line. And nobody was making excuses for Charlottesville, right? People pretend that wasn't, but everyone was like, no, this is not bad. But if you look at what's going on with Antifa, for example, even people in positions of power, even mayors, governors, etc., nobody wants to eat people on the news. No one wants to just come out and say, this is bad. No, this is wrong. Like we don't want these people. Like we don't associate with them. Like people don't want to draw that line. And so I think until that happens, I kind of feel like in this whole, I don't know, this culture war as people call it, I actually feel like what's sort of needed in a way is more like good and courageous and principled liberals to sort of speak up and be willing to draw that line and say, okay, look, this is going too far here, rather than just sort of staying quiet or sort of tacitly approving of it. Just like I would think, if on the right side of the spectrum, if stuff really did start going far, I think, I know I myself, but a lot of people would be happy to be like, okay, look, like, no, this is not the way forward, right? This type of rhetoric, this type of action, etc. I don't know. Imagine if a group of, right-wing Trump supporters created their own autonomous zone in a city and started, running it. The reaction would be really different, right? The mayor wouldn't come out and say, oh yeah, it's like a block party and everyone's just having fun. People would be like, oh my gosh, this is a fascist takeover. Like this is, it would be, the media response would be different. Everything would be totally different, but somehow that can happen, or people can be looting buildings and setting places on fire, running around in masks, beating people up. And no one wants to just say, this is wrong. And until people can do that, I think this issue might just keep getting worse.
The cowardice on the part of people on the left to call out what is wrong is staggering.
Yeah.
I cannot believe it. And you're exactly right. I love your example. Yes, if far right wingers declared an autonomous zone, I mean, that would just it'd be the end of history. It would come to a halt and we would all be confronting the autonomous zone together. But somehow coming from the left, it can't be.
And did you say that, they were doing racial segregation there too? Did you see that?
Of course they were doing racial segregation. I mean, this is the thing. When this came to Evergreen, I had my, wait, what? What are you suggesting? Moment. And then, to the extent that people stopped rationalizing that it wasn't happening, they thought, okay, it's just Evergreen. And then, 3 years later, it has now spilled out into, the whole of the U.S., and it's also spilled into Europe, weirdly, which has a very different racial dynamic, at least in my opinion. I'm actually, it's one of the things I want to ask you about. But my sense is, having done a fair amount of traveling in Europe, even the black-white dynamic is different than we have here in the U.S. Have you spent much time in the U.S.?
A decent amount of time. I was there for 3 months last year. I went to 10 different cities, and I've been there about 6 times in total.
Okay, so you've got recent experience. Do you also have the sense when you cross the pond that you are engaging a very different interracial dynamic?
For me personally, in my own sort of personal experience, in the U.S., I had a great time there, and there was no issues in that regard. One thing I do certainly observe, though, based on people I've known over the years, and this goes to, when I lived in Saudi Arabia even, there were lots of American families living there, white American families, black American families, Asian American, etc. And so I always noticed, even from a relatively young age, that there was a difference in the mindset and the way that people would talk about, any type of racial issue and how people would sort of view things. And I see it online, right? I spend a lot of time on social media. I talk to a lot of people, and the mentality is certainly different. And even the terminology is different. I think it's very interesting that in the USA, you guys say Black American, African American, Latino American, white American, etc. Here we just say British. Right?
There you go.
So it's not common to hear that this person is white British or this person is a black Brit. Like sometimes you'll hear it, but it's quite uncommon. Regardless of someone's ethnic origin, people just say British. And I think that in America, this might seem like a small thing, but I think that it's quite a good example of just the different type of thinking. Or even when it comes to politics, you hear terms like the black vote, right? The white vote. It's sort of, people are more grouped into blocks. In the UK, yeah, sure, there are certain trends and patterns in the voting, but you wouldn't hear politicians or people in the media or et cetera talk about like the black vote in the UK and I understand there are historical reasons for that. There are demographic reasons for that. Black people are a much smaller percentage of the population here in the UK, et cetera. But I think from a unity perspective and from the idea of moving away from various forms of identitarianism, I feel like as long as people speak in these terms, then it's likely to sort of keep people thinking that way, because it does make people think like, okay, there's Black Americans and there's white Americans, and it's by using those labels, I think it sort of keeps people locked in that way of thinking. And I think there are a lot of people who want to be locked in that way of thinking, but I think that there are also a lot of people who don't and just feel like, we're over this, we have eyes, we can see what people look like. That's cool. That's interesting, but it's not the ultimate defining characteristic of a person.